Joe, you work for EA. Who is EA and what do they do?
So we are the Evangelical Alliance. We unite individuals, churches and charities, all with one single purpose: to make Jesus known around the UK and beyond. We're a membership organisation based around evangelical unity, but ultimately we want to do two things. We want to proclaim the gospel in words, in actions, in deeds, so that people have the opportunity to hear the transforming power of the gospel. And we also want to speak up for the gospel and for the church, so raise issues that matter to the church into places of power, so the government, the media, in all four nations of the UK.
Right in the beginning of the book, so interesting, it's actually on page 6, you quote Charles Taylor, and he wrote a tome called A Secular Age. It's like about 600 pages, I think.
Yeah,
Now,
no one's read it. Everyone just quotes it.
Now, the interesting thing is you said, 500 years ago, Taylor says, it was almost unthinkable not to believe in God. Now it's almost unthinkable to believe in God. Is that shift part of the motivation for the book? Because that's a big shift in a relatively short time against human history.
Absolutely. And it's the backdrop to so many things. So one of the things that we talk about in the book is the stories that we're immersed in, because stories shape us. Stories give us understanding, meaning. They tell us how to operate. They give us a kind of framework. And our shared stories, our cultural stories, the stories we all agree on, or at least the stories that we accept and understand that the other person will have the same. So if we want to have a conversation about who we are and how we're to live, then we need to understand the common stories. And that used to be a common story of God. So you didn't have to do the God bit in order to be able to have the discipleship conversation. Now you absolutely have to have the God bit, because the God bit isn't a given. In fact, if anything, it's kind of cute and it's kind of quaint. Oh, yeah. Bless you. So that conversation, that shift in our collective understanding, we have to understand what that is and how it shapes us, so that we're able to bring in the gospel story, the true and better, beautiful story of who we are in God, in order to be able to have a conversation with the people around us.
What are the competing stories that people are grasping to make sense of life?
So we break the conversation around what it means to be human into 4 parts. So we look at the idea of significance, that I matter, you matter, our lives are somehow important. We look at the idea of connection, that we matter to each other, that no man's an island, that we have relationships, that we're wired for relationships, and sometimes they go wrong, sometimes they go right, but we have to relate to each other. We look at the idea that we're present. I'm in a body, I'm in a time zone, it's a different time zone to you, but we are physical, temporal beings. And we look at the idea of participation. That what we do makes a difference, that we have some kind of power in the world. All of these things are true for all of us, but the stories of how they work and what they do and the impact they have, they differ. So significance, for example, L'Oreal has been telling women forever that you're worth it, right? You buy the makeup, you do the hair, but ultimately underneath, you're worth it. But actually, L'Oreal has no capability of telling us why that is, who's worth it more, who's more beautiful. Is beauty at the foundation of our significance? Do you earn it? Do you conjure it up, some kind of internal thing? These stories about your significance float around us all the time. And yet the God story will turn around and say, you matter because you bear the image of the Creator. You point back to the origin of life itself. You matter because you reflect the one who matters most. That is a very different story to the story that we hear all around us every day and everybody's arguing about. So whether it's an immigration thing, whether it's an economic thing, whether it's an education thing, whether it's a beauty thing, those questions of significance are everywhere. And we need to understand some of those stories and the impact that they have on our lives in order to be able to say, actually, do you know why you matter and what that does to who you are and how you treat others? The stories that we surround ourselves in, they shape us. If we think that people have dignity and worth and value, that is a Christian value. If we think that people don't, and it's survival of the fittest, it means that we've adopted a different story. And one of the amazing things about Tom Holland's journey is that he's spent his most of his sort of adult life rejecting the Christian story because it was kind of done and boring and not that adventurous and not that exciting. And so he wanted to be Greco-Roman, or he wanted to sort of investigate some of the other spaces. And what he found was he found worldviews completely antithesis to his actual moral core. And he's like, I can't adopt these worldviews, these stories, because actually they create a world that I do not like and I do not agree with. And I think his journey is really interesting. What I would say is the reason he won't make that leap yet is because whilst he accepts the story as being a very powerful story, he can't accept the author of that story. And that's what he's really honest about. So actually, I would say our book goes one step further in saying that it is in Christ we find these stories, and it is in Christ we find our humanity. And if we don't know that, if we don't experience that, then actually our stories lack the same foundational strength that they actually need.
How did you get into being an apologist? As just a general question.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I feel about that label specifically, but the task I think is really important of helping to defend and commend the Christian story and the good news of Jesus. I think it happened very naturally for me. I grew up going along to church when I was a youngster, and mum and dad try to pass on the faith as best as they could. They were probably a lot more practical in the way that they loved and served Jesus and caring for people that were drug affected and running youth drop-in shelters, more so than talking through the dynamics of what to believe and how it all fits together. And I remember when I was young, we went on a family holiday driving from Brisbane back down to sunny Melbourne to visit some relatives over Christmas. And on the way back to Queensland, had a big car accident in the Blue Mountains in New South Wales that left my mum with significant brain damage from headbutting a truck at high speed. And so that was sort of one of those life-shattering experiences. That was a defining moment for our family. And my mum survived, but much changed in those years afterwards. And so it kind of raised challenges for how do I really believe that God's loving and that he cares and that this is something worth holding on to. And so for most of my teenage years, I largely hit the back door of the church and wasn't forced to go along, never went to youth group really, or didn't get involved in any of the Christian activities, went to a state school with almost entirely secular mates or people from different faith backgrounds. And so my journey into talking about the reasons for belief and wrestling with questions actually started with me having those very same doubts and barriers to belief.
So you go to schools. One of the things we wanted to ask you is, what are the top 5 questions that you get asked?
I used to be able to answer that question easily because it used to be something about science, something about scripture, something about suffering, something about sexuality. And I still think all of those questions are there. But one of the things that has really struck me in the last 18 months or 2 years, and we would do maybe 80 schools talks a year. And so face down close to 1,000 questions a year. Is how diverse those questions are and how much it really is young people just trying to wrestle with the Christian story as a whole. How do I make sense of certain events? How do I make sense of certain implications of if this doctrine or belief were true? Where does this fit with the goodness of God? There's a much bigger intellectual and pastoral tone to it than simply the stock criticisms or concerns. And that isn't to say that they're not there. A suffering question inevitably comes up. A question about God's fairness and judgment inevitably comes up. A question around why God doesn't make himself more obvious or more felt as a reality to everyone around the world always comes up. But these other ones are bubbling away in more diverse ways. And I think it's maybe a reflection on the fact that they are wrestling with Christianity in a new way, trying to make sense of it, but they are largely biblically illiterate. So even though these would be faith-based schools, I think I only do a couple of state school talks a year and more like intro to philosophy or sharing your own personal story. Most of these students from these schools still have grown up in faithless environments without a religious upbringing. And even Christian kids haven't necessarily been well discipled in the Christian story. And so they are very fresh when it comes to biblical literacy. And they are just trying to make sense of, what does it mean? If it were true, how does that affect my life? Where's the relevance levels? And I'd say that the biggest challenge in schools is overcoming that degree of apathy, of recognizing, what does belief in God actually mean for me? How is it relevant to my life?
In the last couple of years, are there questions that have come up that are a bit out of left field that surprised you?
The questions that have surprised me have been the ones that show how connected young people are with the online narratives. We try and keep abreast of what are the algorithms saying to different people in different age groups across social media, particularly on TikTok and Instagram, because they're probably the two primary points of engagement for sort of 15 to 24-year-olds, but also through YouTube, which is our probably prominent place of being on there with the YouTube channel with our ministry. And one of the things I'm definitely noticing there is people are asking specific questions about conversations that are raised on things like the Joe Rogan podcast, something that Jordan Peterson said. And so they're wrestling with particular cultural thinkers from various perspectives and saying, what do you think about this? What do you make of that argument or that idea? And so it's been a wake-up call to me that young people are wrestling with these ideas, but not necessarily doing it in person with teachers or parents or mentor figures, but that they're often having these conversations online, which is what a lot of the research is bearing out.
So the question that was a huge issue for you, and look, there's been books, tomes written on this question, but that issue for you about where's God when it hurts, why does God allow suffering? What are some of the key ideas you give in response to that question?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways you can go about it. One is just to question whether getting rid of God makes any more sense of our experience of the brokenness of the world. I look back at the experience we had with the car accident and the aftermath of my family having to wrestle with mum's new disabilities, and it was just a mess. And there's something that felt profoundly wrong about that whole thing to me. But that intuition that suffering is wrong, or that evil really is evil, and we should call it by that name, those are intuitions that make sense in a world that was created for good but's become damaged by evil in the Christian story. But that's intuitions that don't make a whole lot of sense at all in a purely secular story where naturalism is kind of the underwriting text, where there is at bottom no evil, no good, no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That kind of amoral universe doesn't make sense of our deepest intuitions around suffering and evil. And that actually gives people pause. Get rid of God, sure. The old Epicurus challenge, problem of evil, goes away, but you bump into that new challenge. How do you explain the wrongness of suffering and the evilness of evil? And so the fact of saying to someone, hey, get rid of God, sure. Maybe you don't have this particular intellectual problem anymore, but you don't get any answers. You don't get any hope. You don't get any help. You've just taken away the resources and hope of the Christian story. And that gets people pause. And then you can look at, well, what answers does the Christian story give as to why God may choose to create a world like this, one at least with the potential for things to go wrong? And that classic free will defense, articulated first seemingly by Augustine and then particularly articulated by Alvin Plantinga, goes a long way. God wanted to create a meaningful universe with agents who are capable of affecting this world, of having an influence, of doing meaningful things that are either morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. But particularly, God wanted us to experience love. Deep and meaningful relationships are part of the purpose of our existence, to love God and love others. And if you remove meaningful agency, the ability to say no to God's wisdom rather than to just blindly follow every command like a robot, then you largely, it's hard to see how you hold on to that kind of meaning in those kind of relationships. I think that explanation from Genesis, that God creates the world with a moral fabric, gives us meaningful agency, but then allows us to make our own decisions and to go against God's good design. When we run our hand against the moral grain of his universe, we get splinters. And that's kind of what's happened. But then ultimately to talk, I think the big one though, Karl, is just that, can you trust God?
Yes.
And that's really where the Jesus stuff comes in, because Job as a story, it raises the idea that we can't know all of God's reasons because we don't see all that God sees. We don't know all that God knows, but we know enough to know that even in the darkness and the doubt, we can trust him because he was willing to suffer for us at the cross. And it's that famous God with scars picture that convinced Dostoevsky, that has been so compelling for me, that we worship a God who knows our suffering, who's with us, who would prefer to suffer for us than for us to be left alone in that darkness.
I think a big part of the reason for the outrage we see today is that most of modern society has been, and this feeds into and has flowed from our industrial revolutions, our communications revolution, the digitalizing and virtualizing of our worlds, the development of modern consumer culture, just the way that free markets and supply chains and demand ecosystems operate. What all of this has done for so many different reasons, spiritual, philosophical, economic, sociological, they've turned us all in on ourselves. They've sent us these messages that you are the most important person in the world. You need to do you. You need to live your best life and best self. And anyone out there that stands in the way of that and how you feel about that is to be othered and ostracized and fought against and cancelled and moved out of the way so you can get yours and get what you want. Democracy is actually based on division. So, and I might be in the minority here, but I don't agree with this kind of sugar-coated idealism that why can't they all just get together? Why can't we all just agree? Well, that's a terrible way to govern, and human history's borne that out. That's a totalitarian thing to say, why can't we all just agree? Division's really good for democracy. People need to be disagreeing. We need to be honoring the freedoms of speech and thought and conscience and association. And when you do that, people are going to disagree, and then they're going to clump together. And that's why we have things like political parties and voting blocs and non-government organizations and pressure groups and all of these things, which, as imperfect as the system is, I think are really good. I still think that's the best way of building cohesive societies with people who disagree with each other. Yeah. So division is a good thing. And division's really important. The problem is when politicians or social media companies or social commentators or thought leaders or business leaders or whoever it might be, anyone with influence, uses outrage as a fuel to moralize difference. And once we start moralizing and then weaponizing differences of opinion, differences of belief, different systems of thinking, then we get to this place of contempt where we start looking down on each other. And politics at its best is about looking down on ideas and dismantling ideas and elevating other ideas by appealing to anything and everything, but in such a way that doesn't demean people individually. It doesn't detract from the intrinsic human dignity of people. We need to understand that truth, first of all, the truth exists. So we're going back to first principles here. But in order to work out what that is, I mean, Plato said you got to follow the evidence to where it leads. And so to get to the truth, you have to discern your way through untruths. And the only way to do that is to let everyone have their say. Let everyone have a crack, have an open market of ideas, have an open marketplace of discourse. But also, so while that is happening, also remember very clearly, just through the principles of logic, this isn't a Christian principle, it's just a logical principle, that, while we might say that all people deserve respect, and that certainly syncs with the Christian worldview, the fact that people are made in God's image. All ideas don't deserve respect. All ideas don't deserve respect, and many ideas, I would have to say, in my limited experience, most ideas are bad ideas. But to get to that, we have to be willing to treat one another with respect, treat other people well, and that's how we can work out which ideas to dispose of and move forward together. But I think healthy disagreement is at the very least, it's at least two things. It's a two-step process. The first is that usually, and I'm just thinking through the way people are articulating questions, it seems to be usually about people we're struggling with that we know, that are kind of in our everyday life, people either in our families or our friendship groups or in our churches or our colleagues that we're kind of disagreeing with. The first thing I think is to lead with the relationship. Keep that front and center. That's the most important thing in that interaction. The most important thing is not persuading them to your view. That's secondary. That's still relevant, but it's secondary. The most important thing is deepening the relationship, strengthening the relationship. That relationship will outlast that argument. And in Scripture, we are told to love our neighbors as ourselves, love all people, and love them well. That's the thing that matters for eternity. Like the debate of the moment or the presidential campaign of the moment or the political debate around this particular piece of legislation, that's not unimportant and irrelevant, but it just doesn't have eternal significance or importance in the way that your relationship with that individual does. So the first thing is you want to walk away from that interaction closer to that person. Having that as an objective, I think, is important. And then the second step is making it clear to them as graciously as you can, with the first objective in mind, why you believe what you believe. I think those are the two keys to disagreeing well, is investing in authentic relationships of trust, friendships of trust with people that we disagree with. And secondly, and less importantly, but equally relevantly, then trying to persuade them and explaining to them why you believe what you believe, rather than going after why what they believe is stupid or incorrect. Maybe just share why you believe what you believe. And we see models of this in Scripture too, particularly in the space of kind of evangelism and apologetics. In 1 Peter 3:15, it says, always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. Now, he could have easily said, always be ready to give all the reasons for why what they believe is stupid. Right? But he doesn't. He says, look, what they believe is another thing. There is a space for deconstructing and debate and critique, and unconditional love is not unconditionally affirming. And we know that all ideas are not worthy of respect. So all of that is the case. But the way that the Bible postures the Christian, at least, we can't speak for other people, but the Christian is told to always be ready to give a reason for the hope that they have. The modern tendency for not just Christians, but all people, to be triggered into fits of outrage is very, very easy. We all have very short fuses. And I think what you said earlier, you kind of said it as a throwaway line, Karl, but it's really important that we are more disembodied in our interactions and in our relating to each other. When you're doing stuff through screens, there's just not that level of respect and regard and dignity that you naturally have for someone. And I've been criticized, pretty badly on social media for things that I've written, and then spoken to that person in person, and they were just lovely. And it turned out that, there was a disagreement and we agreed to disagree on something, but there's no way they would have said that to me, to my face. But we're very happy to put it online. There is a place for anger and outrage in the gospel and in the Christian vision of life. When we see the intrinsic dignity of people trampled on, when we see subjugation, when we see God's models for flourishing, trampled on or taken away from people or prevented from reaching people, when we see the freedoms of thought and speech and conscience under threat, these are all good causes for anger and outrage. There is righteous outrage in Scripture. That's a very clear thing that's in there. But importantly, righteous outrage is always submitted to a purpose. It doesn't riff off our emotions. It riffs off God's truth and his heart. So we need to be first looking to, what hurts God and breaks his heart? What does he want for people? He wants people primarily to be in loving relationship with him and in loving relationship with one another. And so when those two things are messed around with or under threat, I think that's a good time to be outraged, but not for long, because that righteous anger and outrage then has to quickly be translated into action. Into all of the fruit of the Spirit in action and in real life. So the outrage has to be followed very quickly by love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control, working for the purposes that we see under threat that invoke the outrage in the first place.
How has our culture changed in regard to masculinity? What's shifting? What's changing?
Well, massively. I guess you could say, I tell you where I do notice it. I've got 3 grown, married, very capable daughters, and the options that are available to them are just massively different to what was available for my mum. The girls they've been to university, they've got careers, they're into sport. There's just all sorts of things that is available to them. And so there's been this massive kind of opening of opportunities for women. And at the same time, I think in that couple of generations, say 30, 40 years, the masculinity thing has just been confused. Or actually worse than confused, I think devalued, maybe even you might say trashed. And that is so... now, has it, if you want to dig down a little bit, has it been part of a organised conspiracy? No, but I did notice as I read more and more about this, as the academics, the activists, and the advertisers have all played their part in that. Well, I grew up as a little boy watching the Brady Bunch. You're probably old enough to remember that.
Yep,
You know, Mike Brady, permed hair, flares, you know, it was the 70s. But he was part of the solution. The wise, you know, thoughtful dad who cared for his family. Or Happy Days, Tom Bosley played Howard Cunningham. And, you know, he was a non-anxious presence. But by the time you get into the 80s, you've got Homer Simpson, or what's the one? Everyone Loves Raymond. And they're really just kind of just negative examples. They're idiots, and yet that's so much the common way that men are portrayed in, you know, sitcoms, etc. I mean, for years we let our toddlers watch Peppa Pig, where Peppa Pig's dad is, well, not surprisingly, a big fat useless pig. So we've kind of raised a generation of kids teaching that dad's an idiot and you don't need to listen to him. I think there's a philosophical reason, if you like, and a physical reason. Let me try with the kind of philosophy of life. A lot of people with the megaphone voices in our culture now believe this whole kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, neo-Marxism or the identity politics or whatever, that the whole world is just oppressors or victims, and you're one or the other. Right? And you can see that through the lens of race or employment or whatever. But when you look at male, female, men have power, and we might come back to that. And just by being a bloke, you have certain power in relationships, bigger, stronger. Women are vulnerable because of motherhood, etc. And if you believe that, then one of the key things you'll be aiming to do is, well, I guess you could just be simple, emasculate men, take the power away from men. So I think there's people who are deliberately trying to undermine male power. And I think male power is not a bad thing if it's used the right way, which it's meant to be. And then there's a physical reason that, given the changes in our culture, that there's so few jobs now that really rely on just sheer physical strength, that we've lived in a really soft and safe culture for, well, the 80th anniversary of D-Day was a couple of months ago. You know, so it's almost 80 years. There's almost no one alive in Australia that remembers a life-threatening conflict for the whole country.
One of the issues that comes up a lot in this same area, you know, is the domestic violence issue, and that masculinity has actually been equated now with toxic masculinity. What's your thoughts there?
Well, it breaks your heart, doesn't it?
It does.
I think, not to be simplistic, I think what it is, when masculinity is devalued and men feel that kind of powerless, there's two wrong reactions that come, and they're kind of the complete opposite of one another. That is, men either drift away and give up and become totally passive. If you're looking for a book to read about that, Philip Zimbardo and Man Disconnected, where he talks about young guys who feel disconnected and powerless while they drift into the virtual world of video games and pornography because the real world's too hard. That's one wrong reaction. The other wrong reaction is kind of the chest thumping abuse that I'll show that I'm powerful. Andrew Tate and others. And so you can see they're both, neither of them are right reactions, but you can see why, and not that I have any sympathy at all for the abusive one, but you can see why those wrong reactions happen. As a Christian man, the Bible gives just such a better way than both of those. Well, if you don't know what or how you're supposed to live as a man, if you haven't got the role models or whatever, and you're looking around, you will end up, a lot of young guys will end up watching and listening and soaking up this, what do they call themselves, these buffheads? The war room or whatever. I think, seriously? Come on,
Yep.
grow up. But you can see young guys who are looking for the role models and who am I and what am I? These guys are saying, you can have power and all the women and the money and the whatever. I want to reach in and grab them and slap them. But you can see the attraction of that.
Yes.
And I can also see the attraction of playing Fortnite and saving the world while you sit in your jammies in your mum's basement.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, so what am I? Part of the reason I wrote this book was that I speak to lots of men's groups and a lot of young guys are really lost.
So what is masculinity? I mean, this is getting to that question and we're sort of dancing around it and we've answered it, etc. But if you were to try and give some sort of approach, if there's if this seminar is full of young blokes in their early 20s or in their mid-teens and they're saying, so what is it to be a bloke?
Yep.
What do we do?
All right, let me say something really controversial. You ready? I'll probably get cancelled for saying this, but there's men and there's women, or there's male and female, and it's binary, okay? Chromosomes, men, women, that's binary, but gender is about the social or relational way that men express being men and women express being women. Right? And there's a great variation in that. So you've got men and women as binary, but gender, the way that men express being masculine, the way that women express being feminine, there's all sorts of variations, okay? We went to Egypt as tourists, and these big burly Egyptian blokes, when they meet each other, they kiss each other on both cheeks. Now, it's going to be weird in the culture I grew up in, but, man, there was nothing feminine about what they were doing. So there's that variation there. So if masculinity is the way that men behave, okay, there's kind of cultural markers for that, and it varies from culture to culture. Now, I'm happy to go back to that if you like, but when you look at what the Bible expects, the Bible speaks to us as individuals, yes, but as individuals in relationship. Mm-hmm. So a man might be, well, every man started off as a son. A man might be a friend. You may be a husband. You may be a father. You may be, a grandfather, which is fun. You'll be a workmate, etc. And then the Bible will tell you in each of those relationships, how should you act? So when you start to put those pieces together, you get a picture of what does the Bible expect of masculinity? How is it that men are supposed to react? Are supposed to act in relation to other people. And I'll tell you what I found. I went through every one of those relationships I could find, and in every one of them, it's just assumed that men have power, the ability to affect other people. Whether it's just as a young man because you're strong, you're physically strong, an older man because you have the power of example and influence, the power that you have as a husband, how you treat your wife, the obvious power you have as a father. In every one of those, the New Testament writers say, yeah, you have this power, be very careful how you use it. Mm. So my working definition is masculinity is about a willingness to take responsibility and use the power you have to love and nurture and care for people.
When Jesus walked the earth, he had encounters with people seeking God. He reached out to the desperate and the outsiders.
People often reject the idea of God or the supernatural.
I knew I wanted a deeper life, as millions of people do.
The reason I believed Christianity was true was I didn't want it to be. I went looking for Buddhism because I thought it would suit me. I went looking for Wicca because I thought it would suit me. I went looking for things I was interested in. But Christianity, or specifically Christ, came to me without me looking for them.
There was a sense deep inside of me, a real hunger or desire for something else. And I knew it was spiritual.
The question, therefore, is not, is there a God? But it's, what is that God like? And as Christians, our answer is Jesus.
Encounters with the divine aren't just strange or unusual ancient stories. They are part of modern life.
There was something about Jesus that made a tax collector get up, stop what he was doing,
and immediately follow Jesus.
I don't think every demon in hell could have stopped me from wanting and getting what was on offer from Jesus Christ.
Who knew in the middle of your life, God willing, that such an encounter could still be available to you?
I feel like God's made sense of everything that I've been through in my life.
I heard this voice as a living voice, but I knew that something was happening, that I wasn't alone in my room reading this.
Yeah.
You know, that there was a divine presence.
There is no way to argue that against that this man met God and God has changed his life.
But I kind of called him out, and I was like, God, you know, now's your chance. Like, if there's ever a time, it's now. And I was like, say something, move something, like anything. And yeah, he did.
How did that change you?
Changed everything.
We travelled the world and talked with a diverse group of people, from a professor to a gay activist, an environmentalist to a drug addict, a journalist to a criminal. They all had a life-changing encounter with Jesus.
That's the difference, because beforehand, it was religion. It was religious. But then when I had that encounter, there was a supernatural encounter where he invaded within inside me and took over.
She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped.
Her life is completely different.
Christ isn't somewhere distant, the other side of Pluto. He's nearer than my own breath.
Join us as we travel across the globe, uncovering encounters with Jesus that transformed lives then and now.
If sin doesn't matter, the cross is irrelevant. But if sin is this kind of spiritual cancer destroying our world, and you can't go to a doctor or a shrink or a politician or an influence to get it sorted, where do you go? 2.6 billion people in our world say, you go to Jesus Christ, who died on the cross.
Our hope is that you too may encounter Jesus and find faith, hope, and life.